Good afternoon. One of the things that I find interesting is, we had a discussion about the fact that in newspapers, all these articles are out there saying, why aren't seatbelts on school buses? But, one of the things that's really interesting when you think of your own children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, those kinds of things again, we have a culture now where as soon as you get into a car, they're buckled in a child safety seat, and then eventually a booster seat. They're used to buckling up. And I think what ends up happening is then they walk onto a school bus and they're just as confused, just like the newspaper saying, wait a minute, where are the seatbelts? I'm getting into a vehicle, there should be seatbelts here. So I think that's interesting. So as Brian mentioned, we're working on a project now related to education on proper use of safety belts on school buses. And the project's in its infancy, so there's not a whole bunch to say right now. As Brian said, it was just just something that we started a little over 2 months ago. The project team includes TOXEL, the North Carolina State University Institute of Transportation Research and Education, and then Derek Graham, who you'll be hearing from next as a consultant who has a lot of experience clearly with seatbelts on school buses. So first thing I want to talk about is a little bit about the project objectives, because the title talks about education on proper use of safety belts on school buses, but it's a little broader than that. And the first thing is to really have a thorough understanding as to what state and local agencies are using when they make the decisions to implement seat belts, and then also look at the funding mechanisms that are used to do so. So, obviously school bus funding comes from a variety of ways and a variety of methods. You'll hear from Derek in North Carolina where everything is pretty much handled at the state level. Then in other states it works very differently and all the decisions are made at the local level and the purchasing contracts are at the local level. So lots of differences in how it's done, and we want to delve into figuring out how it works across the country and what kind of mechanisms might be useful at funding seatbelts on school buses. The next one, and this comes out of the objectives, develop a model policy and a best practices guide to assist jurisdictions that are considering the use of seatbelts. But I think the important thing to mention here is, although it's mentioned as a policy, it's really going to be a set of policies, right? Because, generally what's going to happen is one policy wouldn't necessarily fit even most scenarios, right? So it's going to have to look at things from different viewpoints, in terms of the types of buses that are purchased, how the contracts are done. So looking at best practices and coming up with some model policies that could be used. And then the other interesting one, which is really fascinating to me, is looking at the role of distraction and whether seatbelts aid in managing behavior on school buses. And again, I don't want to steal a bunch of Derek's thunder, but he's going to be sharing with you some really neat information that's going to be eye-opening when it relates to the impacts that seatbelts have. I think most people look at seatbelts from the standpoint as just being what happens in the situation where a school bus is in a crash. But there's quite a bit of evidence out there that's showing that just the use of seatbelts in general can have major improvements in child behavior, and of course that means that the bus driver is not going to be as distracted, and it also means that the kids aren't trying to figure out how to get around the bus and start hitting each other and other types of things that can sometimes happen on school buses. So those are the objectives of the project. The approach really aligns closely with the objectives. So the first part is the reaching out step, and we're in the process now of going through the appropriate approvals to be able to talk to many people about current practices. So definitely stay tuned and expect to hear from us for sure. Then the next step is, and also kind of working simultaneously, is looking at the state and local policies that are actually used that have funded seatbelts on school buses. Then from that, looking at the best practices and getting some lessons learned from the folks that have developed policies, developing model policies and best practices that could be communicated for folks that are considering adding their own legislation or policies. And then ultimately, obviously, the way that that's going to get communicated is through the final report, but also identifying how seatbelts affect student behavior. Putting that all together, packaging it in a way so that way folks will understand, the benefits that folks have experienced and some good ways that can be done. And as far as the model policy and best practices guide, it's going to be looking at several things. Looking at acquisition and implementation information that school transportation professionals experience throughout the United States. That's going to be done by having interviews with the state directors of pupil transportation in areas where there are school bus seatbelt policies, but it's also going to be reaching out to the jurisdictions as well. And then also when it comes to the behavior piece, getting some feedback from bus drivers that have had experience with school bus, with students with and without seatbelts on their school buses. And then the draft model policy is really going to really be helpful to folks that are looking to adopt and implement, potential new regulations. I'm going to leave the presentation by talking about the seatbelt impacts on student behavior, because again, that's something that I think generally gets lost in the translation when it comes to potential benefits of seatbelts on school buses. And obviously the hope is as we actually look at the information that's out there, most of it's going to be anecdotal, but really looking at whether seatbelts deter student misbehavior when used properly, and then also figuring out situations as to whether or not the school bus drivers might feel a little bit less distracted because of a lessened misbehavior on school buses where those are used. So like I mentioned, I think that this is going to be really eye-opening and very graphic, especially when Derek comes up here to present his North Carolina experiences. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to Derek. And I promise you, and I'm building you up, Derek, but it really is fascinating. So I think you'll be very, very impressed with what he has to share.